Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take fascinating, sometimes complex source material historical records, ancient texts, theological ideas, and really unpack them for you.
Giving you the core insights, the distilled knowledge you need.
And today, we are tackling a really big one, a huge historical prophecy, the 70 years of Jerusalem's desolation. You probably know it as the Babylonian exile.
Right. 70 years. It sounds like a nice round number, doesn't it?
It does, but the central question we're diving into is,
Right.
when exactly did those 70 years actually begin and when did they end? It's trickier than it sounds.
Oh, absolutely. Because the source material we're working with, books like Jeremiah, Kings, Daniel, they present chronological data that can seem, well, a bit conflicting at times.
That's putting it mildly. Different scribes, different kingdoms, different ways of counting time.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack these ancient sources, try to reconcile those discrepancies you mentioned, and really try to nail down the definitive start and end points for this crucial 70-year period.
And it's not just about dates, is it? It's about understanding the historical context, the symbolic meaning behind it all.
Precisely. And just a heads up for you listening, this involves getting into the weeds a little bit with ancient calendar systems and how they counted a king's reign, specifically this idea of accession year versus non-accession year counting.
Right. That sounds technical, but it's actually key.
It is. It's the main reason you see these 1 or 2 year differences popping up in historical records of this period. So yeah, we'll guide you through that complexity because understanding it is crucial to getting the timeline straight.
Okay, let's dive in then.
Yeah.
All right, setting the stage. The whole 70-year clock really starts ticking with one key figure, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He's pivotal.
He absolutely is. He's the historical engine driving this whole period. Now, based on our sources, Nebuchadnezzar first took the throne, his accession. We call it around BC 606.
Okay, BC 606. Seems straightforward enough.
But here's where the calendar problem, as we term it, begins. The date itself isn't disputed, but how that year was recorded and counted, that's where the divergence starts.
Okay, let's break this down because, as you said, it's fundamental. What's the actual difference between an accession year count and a non-accession year count? And why did, say, the Babylonians do it differently from the Judeans?
Right. It boils down to when you officially start counting year 1 of a king's reign. In the ancient Near East, there were 2 main systems. The Babylonians generally used what's called the non-accession method.
Non-accession. Meaning,
if a king came to power partway through a calendar year, let's say, Nebuchadnezzar in BC 606, the Babylonians would count the rest of that year simply as the beginning of the reign, or the accession period. His official year 1 wouldn't actually start until the next new year began.
Okay, so under the Babylonian system, Nebuchadnezzar takes the throne sometime in BC 606. That remainder of the year is his accession year. But his official first year, year 1, is actually BC 605.
Exactly right. Now, compare that to the system sometimes used in Judah. They often use the accession year count, which means the year the king actually ascended was counted as his year 1. So a Judean scribe recording an event happening in BC 606 might very well call it Nebuchadnezzar's first year,
while the Babylonian scribe, recording the same event in the same year, BC 606, would consider it the accession year and date it relative to BC 605 as year 1.
Precisely. And that 1-year difference, purely down to bookkeeping methods, creates this ripple effect. Every subsequent event, the deportations, the temple's destruction, could be dated a year differently depending on which source, which counting method you're looking at.
Wow. Okay, so understanding that difference is absolutely crucial before we even look at the specific events.
It really is. You have to keep it in mind constantly when comparing the records. Hashtag 1.2, the first wave of captivity, the start of the 70 years. So with that foundation laid, let's look at the event that actually starts the 70-year clock. And interestingly, it's not the final destruction of the temple, which happened much later.
No, it's the first major deportation of captives from Judah to Babylon. This is the event that really marks the beginning of Judah's subjugation.
That's the one. It's historically significant because this is when key figures like Daniel and his companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken to Babylon. High-status youths, royals, intellectuals.
And right here at this very first crucial event, we hit that calendar conflict we just discussed. We have 2 key biblical sources describing it.
We do. First, Jeremiah 25, verse 1. It places this event in the 4th year of King Jehoiakim of Judah. And it specifically notes that this corresponds to Nebuchadnezzar's first official year.
Okay, Jehoiakim's 4th year, Nebuchadnezzar's 1st year.
But then you look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. It's clearly describing the same event, Nebuchadnezzar besieging Jerusalem, taking these prominent young men. But Daniel records it happening in Jehoiakim's 3rd year.
3rd year versus 4th year. So how do we square that with Jehoiakim's own timeline? Our sources generally place his reign from about BC 609 down to BC 598.
Right. So if Jehoiakim began reigning in BC 609, well, using standard counting, his 3rd year would be BC 607. His 4th year would be BC 606.
BC 607 versus BC 606, there's that 1-year gap again.
Exactly. The difference between Jeremiah saying 4th year and Daniel saying 3rd year almost certainly reflects one scribe using a system that included the partial accession year, making it the 3rd year ending in 607, while the other started the count later, perhaps aligned with the Babylonian non-accession 1st year, making it the 4th year ending in 606.
So what's the key takeaway for someone trying to understand this period?
The main point isn't about catching out the scribes. It's that the first captivity happened right around that hinge point, BC 607/BC 606. This event, this political capitulation, and the removal of Judah's elite, that's what initiated the 70 years of servitude to Babylon prophesied by Jeremiah. That's when the countdown starts.
Regardless of whether you label the starting year the 3rd or the 4th of Jehoiakim, the historical reality is the same.
Precisely. The ancient writers weren't making mistakes. They were just using the different accepted timekeeping conventions of their day. It actually validates the historical accounts while explaining the apparent inconsistency.
That's a fascinating insight. It shows the level of detail needed to really grapple with these texts. Hashtag 1.3, subsequent deportations and conflicting records.
Okay, so that first deportation in 607-606 BC established Babylonian dominance. But they weren't done. Nebuchadnezzar's forces returned several times over the next couple of decades.
Right, each time tightening the screws, deporting more people, further dismantling Judah as a functioning kingdom.
And the book of Jeremiah, specifically chapter 52, gives us some very precise, though likely incomplete, numbers for these later waves of captives.
So let's track these, keeping that potential 1-year dating variance in mind. What was the next major event?
That would be the second captivity. Jeremiah 52, verse 28, records 3,023 people being taken captive, and it dates this event specifically to Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year.
Okay, Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year, according to Jeremiah.
But then you look at the parallel account, 2 Kings 24, verse 12. It describes the same event. This is when King Jehoiachin himself was taken away, but it attributes it to Nebuchadnezzar's 8th year.
7th versus 8th, there it is again, that 1-year jump. How does that map onto the BC timeline?
Well, if we stick with the idea that Nebuchadnezzar's first official year, non-accession, was BC 605, then his 7th year would be BC 599, and his 8th year would be BC 598. Our analysis leans towards BC 599-598 for this event. Let's say roughly 598 for simplicity here.
BC 598. And this second wave was hugely significant too, wasn't it?
Immensely. This is when the prophet Ezekiel was deported, and also Hadassah, the young woman who would later become Queen Esther in Persia. This deportation essentially stripped Judah of its remaining leadership, the king, the military commanders, the skilled artisans.
So again, the difference between the 7th and 8th year count is minor for the overall 70-year span, but pinpointing it around BC 598 gives us powerful context for when figures like Ezekiel and Esther were transplanted to Babylon.
Exactly. Then, sadly, we reach the final devastating blow, the third captivity. This is the event that truly brought about the desolation of Jerusalem.
The destruction of the city and the temple.
Yes. Jeremiah 52, verse 29, lists a smaller number this time. 832 people taken captive. And it dates this to Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year.
18th year. But again, there's another account.
There is. 2 Kings 25, verse 8, describes the climax, the actual burning of Solomon's temple, the king's palace, all the major buildings, and it places this catastrophic event in Nebuchadnezzar's 19th year.
18th versus 19th year, for arguably the most pivotal moment in the entire exile. What explains this difference?
The source material suggests a very practical reason here. The final siege of Jerusalem was long and brutal. It lasted many months, possibly over a year.
So the siege might have started in one regnal year, but the final breaching of the walls, the capture, the systematic destruction, that process could easily have stretched across the boundary into the next regnal year, depending on when the calendar officially turned over.
Exactly. The fighting ends, maybe that's recorded as the 18th year, But the organized demolition, the burning, happens a bit later, falling into the 19th year, according to the scribe's calendar.
Okay, that makes sense. So when do the sources ultimately date this final destruction?
Following the timeline where Nebuchadnezzar's official year 1 is BC 605, his 18th year would be BC 588, and his 19th year BC 587. The source material we're analyzing tends to settle on BC 587 as the date for the definitive destruction of the city and temple. That event truly fulfilled the prophecy of Jerusalem becoming desolate.
BC 587. A date etched in history. Is that the end of the deportations mentioned?
Almost. There's one final footnote, really, which emphasizes just how thorough the Babylonians were. The fourth captivity, Jeremiah 52, verse 30, mentions a small final cleanup operation, you could say.
Yeah.
Another 745 people taken away in Nebuchadnezzar's 23rd year.
23rd year. So that would be around BC 583, 582.
That's right, around BC 582. It shows that even years after the main destruction, Babylon was still mopping up, removing anyone who might cause trouble, ensuring total control.
So if you add up those specific numbers from Jeremiah 52, the 3,023, the 832, the 745, you get 4,600 people.
Right, but we know from other contexts that the total number deported over all the waves was vastly larger than that. Jeremiah 52 seems to be recording specific groups or tallies, not the grand total.
Got it. So stepping back, the listener needs to grasp that these year discrepancies, 7th versus 8th, 18th versus 19th, while important for detailed history, don't fundamentally alter the 70-year prophecy. They're reflections of ancient record-keeping nuances.
Exactly. Methodological noise, you could call it. It actually confirms the authenticity we're dealing with, real contemporary records with their own conventions, not a later perfectly harmonized account.
Okay, so we've established the starting point around BC 607, 606, marked by that first deportation and the beginning of servitude. Now let's turn to the prophecy itself. How did Jeremiah define the duration and scope of this period? And how do we pinpoint the end? Hashtag tag 2.1, defining the scope of the 70 years.
Jeremiah's prophecy is incredibly specific about what the 70 years entail. It's not just about the people being captive. It's also about the land itself.
Ah, right. There's a dual aspect.
There is. Jeremiah 25, verse 11, lays it out clearly. It says two things will happen. First, this whole land will become a desolate wasteland. And second, these nations, meaning Judah and surrounding nations, will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years.
So 70 years covers both human servitude and the physical desolation of the land of Judah. Abandoned, uncultivated ruin.
That's the scope. A double judgment hitting both the people and their homeland. And Jeremiah 29, verse 10, gives this absolute promise of a fixed endpoint. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, God says, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place.
Completed for Babylon. That phrasing seems important. It ties the 70 years directly to the lifespan of Babylonian dominance.
It does. The timer is set at exactly 70 years. No more, no less. And here's a crucial part of the prophecy. The end of Israel's 70 years isn't just about their freedom, it's linked to Babylon's downfall.
Right. Jeremiah 25, verse 12 actually promises that when the 70 years are up, Babylon itself will be punished for its own wickedness and eventually made desolate forever.
It's an incredible linkage. The prophecy insists that the fall of the mighty Babylonian Empire and the liberation of the Judean exiles must happen concurrently, right at that 70-year mark. It speaks volumes about divine sovereignty over world powers.
Okay, so the end of the 70 years has to align with that major geopolitical shift. Hashtag tag 2.2, pinpointing the end date.
Precisely. The end point has to coincide with the fall of Babylon and the rise of the next empire, which was the Medo-Persian Empire.
And this brings in another key historical figure, Cyrus the Great of Persia.
Yes, Cyrus is the agent God uses to fulfill Jeremiah's prophecy. The historical sequence is Babylon falls to the Medes under Darius, and then the Persians under Cyrus take preeminence. Cyrus becomes the key player for the restoration.
And his specific action is the trigger for the end of the 70 years.
It is. The sources are clear. In the very first year of Cyrus's reign over the conquered Babylonian territories, he issues a famous decree. You know it as the Cyrus Edict.
The one recorded in both 2 Chronicles and Ezra.
That's the one. 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra chapter 1 record Cyrus making a proclamation throughout his kingdom, specifically authorizing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of the Lord.
That decree effectively ended the state of desolation, right? As official permission to rebuild and repopulate.
Exactly. It marked the end of the desolation period. But just like we had that slight one-year variance at the start, BC 607 or 606, we find a similar tiny bit of flexibility at the end depending on exactly which event you peg as the fulfillment.
Okay, let's walk through the math here for the listener, connecting back to those two possible start dates.
Right. So we have option A. This aligns the earliest start date with the earliest possible end date. If we mark the end by the official announcement of Cyrus's decree, historical consensus places that around BC 537.
BC 537 for the decree.
Now, count back exactly 70 years from BC 537. Where do you land?
BC 607.
BC 607, which perfectly matches the start date derived from Daniel's record of the first captivity happening in Jehoiakim's third year. So BC 607 to BC 537 is exactly 70 years.
Okay, that's option A. What's option B?
Option B uses the slightly later start date and a slightly later end marker. What if the true end of the desolation wasn't just the paper decree, but the physical start of the rebuilding, the actual laying of the new temple's foundation?
When did that happen?
The Book of Ezra suggests the returnees got organized, gathered materials, and laid the foundation the following year, which would be BC 536.
BC 536 for the foundation laying.
Right. Now, count back 70 years from BC 536.
That takes us to BC 606.
BC 606. Which perfectly matches the start date derived from Jeremiah's record of the first captivity being in Jehoiakim's fourth year, corresponding to Nebuchadnezzar's accession year approach. So BC 606 to BC 536 is also exactly 70 years.
Wow. So whether you calculate it as BC 607 to 537 or BC 606 to 536, the duration is precisely 70 years in both cases.
Exactly. The math works perfectly either way, accounting for those initial dating system differences.
So what's the big takeaway from this perfect alignment?
The profound point isn't about locking down 607 versus 606. It's about the absolute fulfillment of the prophesied duration. The divine guarantee held true. The 70-year period of captivity and desolation was completed exactly as foretold, whichever valid ancient counting method you apply.
That precision is incredible, and it sets the stage for later prophecies too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This confirmed 70-year period becomes the bedrock, the anchor point for understanding subsequent prophetic timelines, especially Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, which starts with the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. The timing wasn't accidental, it was meticulously planned and executed.
Okay, we've meticulously established the timeline, the when and how long. But the sources also tell a dramatic story about why the 70-year judgment was necessary. It involves human choices, rebellion, defiance, particularly from Judah's last kings.
Yes, the why is crucial. The resistance to God's word, funneled through the prophet Jeremiah, really started escalating with King Jehoiakim. He embodies defiance.
He was the one who actively rebelled not just against Nebuchadnezzar politically, but against the direct written word of God.
He did. The story in Jeremiah 36 is just astonishing. Jeremiah dictated prophecies of doom warning that Babylon would destroy the land onto a scroll. The scroll was then read aloud to King Jehoiakim.
And his reaction wasn't repentance or fear?
Not at all. He was sitting in his winter palace, it says, with a fire burning in a brazier nearby. As sections of the scroll were read out, he took a scribe's knife, calmly cut off the columns of the scroll, and threw them into the fire until the entire scroll was destroyed.
Just incredible arrogance. He literally tried to burn God's warning away.
His own officials were horrified, apparently begging him not to do it. But he refused. He wouldn't humble himself. He thought he could just erase the prophecy.
And that act had dire consequences prophesied for him personally, right?
It did. Jeremiah was told to write it all down again and add a specific judgment against Jehoiakim. His dead body wouldn't receive a proper royal burial. Instead, it would be thrown out, exposed to the heat by day and the frost by night. A truly ignominious end for a king who showed such contempt for God's word.
Then fast forward to the final king, Zedekiah. He reigned during that final terrible siege and destruction. His failure was perhaps even more profound theologically.
Yes, because Zedekiah's rebellion involved breaking a sacred oath. Nebuchadnezzar had actually installed Zedekiah on the throne as a vassal king.
And made him swear allegiance.
Critically, yes. 2 Chronicles 36 says Nebuchadnezzar made Zedekiah swear an oath by God, by Yahweh, the God of Israel, that he would remain loyal to Babylon.
Swearing by God himself, that's a heavy vow.
Extremely heavy. Yet, despite that solemn, God-invoked covenant, Zedekiah broke it. He hardened his heart, rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and disastrously turned to Egypt for help, which Jeremiah had warned against.
And that broken oath sealed Judah's fate, didn't it?
It seems to be the final straw. Jeremiah had already prophesied specifically to Zedekiah that he wouldn't escape the Babylonians, that he would be captured and brought face to face with Nebuchadnezzar.
And the fulfillment was brutal.
Tragically literal. Zedekiah tried to flee Jerusalem as it fell, but was caught. He was dragged before Nebuchadnezzar, forced to watch his own sons being executed right in front of him, and then immediately after, Nebuchadnezzar had Zedekiah's eyes put out.
Horrifying. The last thing he ever saw was the death of his heirs.
And then he was bound in chains and taken off to Babylon, blinded and broken. The complete destruction of Jerusalem and the temple followed right after. It was the devastating culmination of generations of turning away from God, capped off by Zedekiah's ultimate act of covenant-breaking defiance. Hashtag tag 3.2 Babylonian deference post-destruction.
Given that level of brutality, especially towards Zedekiah, it's quite striking that the sources also show moments where the Babylonians acted with, well, a surprising degree of care, or at least pragmatic administration, toward the people left behind in Judah.
It does seem like a contrast, doesn't it? But it likely reflects calculated imperial policy. Once total victory was achieved and the rebellious leadership eliminated, their goal shifted towards stabilizing the conquered territory.
So what did they do?
Nebuchadnezzar appointed a Judean governor named Gedaliah to oversee the poorest people who remained the farmers, the vineyard workers, those left to work the land.
So they didn't just leave it as a total wasteland. They set up some kind of local administration.
They did. And Jeremiah 40 tells us Gedaliah, under Babylonian authority, actually encouraged the remaining population. He told them basically, don't be afraid of the Babylonian officials. Settle down, serve the king of Babylon, gather the harvest, the wine, the summer fruits, the oil, and things will go well for you.
So as a strategy to maintain some level of productivity and order, even in a conquered province.
Exactly. Keep the peace, get the resources, minimize further trouble. It was practical empire management.
And this sense of, maybe not kindness, but perhaps calculated deference, extended even to the captive royalty later on.
It did, remarkably so. Years passed, Nebuchadnezzar died. His successor, a king named Evil-Merodach, came to the throne in Babylon, and he did something quite unexpected for the former Judean king, Jehoiachin.
Jehoiachin, he was the one taken captive in that second wave, back around 598 BC.
That's him. He'd been imprisoned in Babylon for 37 years by this point. Evil-Merodach, in his first year as king, released Jehoiachin from prison.
Released him after nearly 4 decades.
Released him. And more than that, the account in 2 Kings 25 says Evil-Merodach spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of all the other captive kings who were also in Babylon.
Wow. Elevated status.
Yes. He gave him new clothes, took off his prison garments, and ensured Jehoiachin ate regularly at the king's own table for the rest of his life. It's a significant gesture of favor towards the Davidic line, even in exile.
It really shows that even within the context of judgment and captivity, there are these threads of, well, maybe not redemption yet, but certainly complexity and perhaps even a foreshadowing of future restoration. God's plan was still unfolding, even in Babylon.
Precisely. It shows the situation wasn't static. Attitudes could shift, even within the ruling empire.
But perhaps the biggest reason for any shifts in Babylonian attitude, and ultimately the reason the 70 years ended exactly on schedule, wasn't just politics or pragmatism. The sources point strongly towards the spiritual impact of Jewish exiles, especially figures like Daniel had on the Babylonians, including Nebuchadnezzar himself.
Absolutely. This is a crucial part of the narrative. It's a story of how God worked through his captive people to influence, even challenge, the most powerful empire on earth from the inside out.
It starts early on with Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, doesn't it?
It does. Daniel interprets the king's first major dream, the one about the giant statue made of different metals. Gold head, silver chest, bronze belly, iron legs.
Representing successive world empires. Babylon was the head of gold.
Right. And after Daniel reveals not just the interpretation, but the dream itself, which Nebuchadnezzar had forgotten, the king is stunned. He falls prostrate before Daniel and declares that Daniel's God is, quote, the God of gods and the Lord of kings.
A huge acknowledgement from the world's most powerful ruler. You'd think that would be enough.
You would think, but human pride, well, it's persistent. Because despite acknowledging Daniel's God and the dream's meaning that his golden kingdom was just the first and would be replaced, what does Nebuchadnezzar do next?
He builds a statue.
Not just any statue, a colossal statue, maybe 90 feet tall, made entirely of gold. And he commands everyone in his empire, all the officials, governors, leaders from every province, to come and worship it upon penalty of death.
This is the famous story from Daniel 3. He's actually tried to override the prophecy, didn't he? Make his golden kingdom permanent and demand universal allegiance to it.
It looks exactly like that, a direct challenge. And of course, this forces the issue for devout Jews like Daniel's friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, worship the golden image or face the fiery furnace.
And their response is legendary.
It truly is. They refuse. point blank. Their statement to Nebuchadnezzar is remarkable. They say, essentially, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up.
That, but even if not, is incredibly powerful. Faith, regardless of the outcome.
It defines unwavering faith. And, of course, the miracle happens. They're thrown in, the furnace is heated 7 times hotter, yet they walk around unharmed in the flames, joined by a fourth figure who looks like a son of the gods, as Nebuchadnezzar himself describes him.
And this miracle forces Nebuchadnezzar's hand again.
Completely. He calls them out, sees they're untouched by the fire, and he issues another decree, this time praising the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and declaring that anyone, anywhere in his empire who speaks anything against their God will be torn limb from limb.
So religious protection mandated by the emperor, compelled by a miracle.
Yes. But even that wasn't the final lesson for Nebuchadnezzar. The ultimate humbling came later, addressing his deep-seated pride.
This is the story of the 7 years of madness.
That's right, Daniel chapter 4. Again, it starts with a dream, interpreted by Daniel, warning the king about his arrogance. The king is warned he'll be driven away from people, live like a wild animal, eating grass like an ox, until he acknowledges that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomever he wishes.
And the king ignores the warning.
For a time. About a year later, the text says he's walking on the roof of his palace, looking over the magnificent city he built, and he says aloud, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty?"
Uh-oh. Famous last words.
Almost literally. While the words were still in his mouth, a voice from heaven declared the judgment fulfilled. Immediately, Nebuchadnezzar lost his sanity. He was driven out to live with the beasts. His hair grew like eagle's feathers, his nails like bird's claws. He lived like this for 7 times, likely 7 years. Until, as the text says, he lifted his eyes to heaven, his reason returned, and he blessed the Most High, praising and honoring him who lives forever. He finally fully acknowledged God's absolute sovereignty over all kingdoms, including his own.
And the significance of this goes beyond just Nebuchadnezzar's personal conversion, right?
Absolutely, because after his sanity was restored, Nebuchadnezzar himself wrote down this entire testimony. Daniel 4 actually begins with Nebuchadnezzar issuing a proclamation to all peoples, nations, and languages throughout his empire, telling them about the signs and wonders the Most High God had performed for him.
So his personal humbling became an official state document, broadcast across the known world.
Exactly. This divine intervention, mediated through Daniel and his friends, fundamentally impacted the spiritual and political landscape of the Babylonian Empire. It helped create a context where later Persian rulers like Darius and Cyrus, who were also exposed to Daniel's influence, were perhaps more predisposed to acknowledge the God of Israel and act favorably towards his people.
Leading directly to Cyrus, issuing that decree that ended the 70 years. It's all interconnected.
Beautifully, yes. The spiritual groundwork was laid within the empire itself.
So we've explored the timeline, the reasons, the key players, but the source material strongly suggests that the story of the 70 years isn't just ancient history. It serves as a powerful template, even a prophecy, for understanding future events. Hashtag 4.1, the broader significance of the 70 years.
That's a crucial dimension. One of the most profound layers of meaning, often missed, is how the 70 years connect to the concept of the land needing its Sabbath rest.
Sabbath rest for the land. Explain that.
Well, the law of Moses in the Old Testament commanded the Israelites not only to rest on the 7th day, but also to let their agricultural land lie fallow, unplanted, every 7th year. This was the sabbatical year. They were also supposed to observe a jubilee year after every 7 sabbatical cycles.
Okay, a divinely mandated rest for the land itself.
Exactly. But the historical record and the prophets indicate that for centuries, Israel largely ignored this command. They continuously farmed the land without giving it these required rests.
And the 70-year exile is seen as, what, a payback for that?
Precisely. The Book of 2 Chronicles, right at the end when describing the exile, explicitly states that the desolation lasted until the land had enjoyed its Sabbath rests. It says the land lay desolate for the whole 70 years to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah.
So the duration, 70 years, wasn't arbitrary. It corresponds to the accumulated missed Sabbaths.
That's the theological calculation the source material points towards. If you estimate the period from when Israel entered the land until the exile, they would have failed to observe roughly 70 sabbatical years over that span, approximately 490 years divided by 7. So, the 70 years of forced desolation allowed the land to finally catch up on all the rest it had been denied.
That reframes the exile significantly. It's not just punishment on the people, but a restoration for the land, a cosmic balancing of the books.
It adds that ecological or covenantal dimension, yes. And once that specific debt was paid, once the land had received its due rest and the 70 years were complete, that active completion set the stage chronologically for the next great prophetic timeline.
Which is?
Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. Daniel 9 explicitly states that Daniel understood the 70-year duration from reading Jeremiah. And it's right after contemplating the end of those 70 years that he receives the vision of the 70 weeks, or sevens, of years, which begins with the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, the very event that marked the end of the desolation.
So the end of the 70 years of desolation is the precise starting pistol for the 70 weeks prophecy. It's a critical hinge point in the whole prophetic scheme.
Absolutely vital. One period ends, the next begins, anchored by that specific historical fulfillment. Hashtag tag 4.2, the symbolic weight of Babylon.
Given that historical Babylon fell and the 70 years were completed, why does Babylon continue to loom so large as a symbol in later prophecy, especially in the New Testament book of Revelation?
That's because historical Babylon became the quintessential archetype of organized human power, wealth, and culture set up in defiance of God. Its symbolic roots go way back.
Back before Nebuchadnezzar.
Oh, yes. The source material traces the lineage of Babylon back to its very founding by Nimrod, described in Genesis 10 as a mighty hunter before the Lord. His kingdom began at Babel, the site of the infamous Tower of Babel,
where humanity united to build a tower to reach the heavens in defiance of God's command to spread out and fill the earth.
Exactly. So from its origins, Babylon symbolized consolidated human power trying to usurp divine authority. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon in the time of the exile just amplified and cemented that symbolism.
How so? Through its military conquest.
That was part of it, but also through its immense pride and, crucially, its acts of sacrilege. The ultimate example was what happened under Nebuchadnezzar's successor, Belshazzar, at that infamous feast described in Daniel 5.
The writing on the wall incident?
That's the one. Belshazzar, in a drunken display of arrogance, commanded that the sacred vessels, the gold and silver cups and bowls that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the temple in Jerusalem be brought out.
And use them for what?
Use them for a pagan party. He, his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank wine from these holy temple vessels and praised their own gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone.
Using consecrated objects dedicated to Yahweh to toast idols. That's the height of desecration.
It truly is. That act perfectly encapsulated the spirit of Great Babylon, taking what is holy to God and profaning it, integrating it into a system of idolatry and self-glorification. That historical reality is why Babylon becomes the enduring symbol for the final global system of rebellion against God described in Revelation.
Got it. So historical Babylon provides the perfect template. Hashtag tag 4.3 analogy to the final week.
And the sources we're looking at draw very explicit parallels between the experiences during that 70-year Babylonian period and what is prophesied to happen during the very final period of human history, often linked to the final week of Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy.
Okay, let's connect those dots clearly for the listener. What are the key analogies the source material highlights?
There's a striking three-part analogy. First, the parallel of captivity. Just as historical Israel was politically and geographically captive under the king of Babylon for 70 years, the prophecy suggests that in the end times, God's people will find themselves similarly captive within a global political and economic system, the future Great Babylon, that exerts immense control.
Okay, captivity is the first parallel. What's the second?
The second, and perhaps most vivid, is the parallel of the image. Remember Nebuchadnezzar's giant golden image that everyone was forced to worship?
Yes, the trigger for the fiery furnace incident.
The source material draws a direct line from that historical event to the future image of the beast, described in Revelation 13, which the whole world will also be commanded to worship.
And the chilling implication from the source.
The chilling implication, based on the Babylonian precedent, is that just as most people in Nebuchadnezzar's empire apparently did bow down to the golden image, only Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are recorded as refusing.
You're saying.
The analogy suggests that when the future image of the beast is established, the vast majority of people on Earth, potentially including many who identify as believers, will also comply and give it allegiance, whether through direct worship or participation in its economic system, the mark. The pressure will be immense, perhaps framed as necessary for survival or societal harmony.
That's a very sobering thought, which brings us to the third parallel, the response of the faithful remnant.
Exactly, refusal and persecution. What distinguished the true believers like Daniel's friends in Babylon? They refused to compromise their allegiance to God, even when facing death.
Their faith was demonstrated by their actions.
Absolutely. And the source material stresses this point intensely for the end times. It insists that genuine saints will be identifiable by their refusal to worship the beast or receive its mark.
And unlike the fiery furnace, miraculous deliverance might not always be the outcome.
The implication is that this refusal will often lead directly to severe persecution, economic exclusion, imprisonment, martyrdom, as described in Revelation and hinted at by Jesus' words in Luke 21. Or it might necessitate fleeing into hiding, perhaps a symbolic wilderness where God provides protection, as seen in Revelation 12.
So the Babylonian experience, particularly the furnace, serves as a crucial template for understanding the nature of faith required in the final crisis. It's about uncompromising obedience.
That seems to be the core ethical takeaway from the sources we've examined. They drive home the point that faith is proven by action, especially under pressure. Genuine belief isn't just intellectual assent. It's verified by one's willingness to obey God's commands, even at great personal cost, potentially even the cost of one's life, shedding one's blood, rather than bowing to the prevailing idolatry, or accepting the mark of allegiance to the anti-God system.
So the 70 years taught a hard lesson. The ultimate test isn't just enduring suffering, but making the right choice when faced with the demand to compromise fundamental allegiance.
That's the crux of it. The choice between comfortable compliance with the system versus costly, uncompromising faithfulness to God. #outro chat.
Well, we have certainly taken a deep dive today into the 70 years of Jerusalem's desolation. We've waded through the chronological complexities comparing Jeremiah, Kings, Daniel.
Trying to reconcile those ancient records and pin down that crucial time frame.
And I think we've landed on some key findings. The 70 years weren't just a random number. They were a specific, divinely determined period, roughly BC 607 or 606, down to BC 537 or 536.
And fulfilling multiple prophetic layers simultaneously. It was about judgment for Judah's sin, yes, but also about paying back the land's accumulated Sabbath rest, an exact 70-year debt being settled.
We also trace the narrative arc, the tragic defiance of kings like Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, which made the judgment necessary, contrasted with the surprising resilience and spiritual influence of the exiles like Daniel, which ultimately impacted even the heart of the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar.
And crucially, we saw how this entire historical episode isn't just history. It functions as an essential prophetic template. It establishes the chronological anchor for Daniel's 70 weeks and provides a powerful moral framework for understanding the challenges facing believers in the end times, particularly regarding allegiance to God versus allegiance to worldly systems symbolized by Babylon.
I think the most vital takeaway, the thread running through all the source material we looked at, isn't really about getting the calendar dates perfect down to the day. It's about the principle, the willingness of God's people to prioritize absolute obedience to Him, even when that means defying overwhelming political power, even when it looks like suicide.
That lesson of faithfulness under pressure seems timeless, applicable in Nebuchadnezzar's day and equally relevant now.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider, building on that very idea.
If the historical experience under Babylon, especially that pressure to conform, symbolized by the golden image, is genuinely a template for the future, what might that look like today? If the pressure isn't a literal statue or a fiery furnace, but something more subtle, more systemic.
Think about it. What compromises, perhaps cleverly disguised as pragmatism or economic necessity or social responsibility or even keeping the peace, what subtle pressures might be tempting believers today to metaphorically bow to the golden image of our time? What does uncompromising faithfulness look like in this era?
Something to definitely ponder.
Thank you for diving deep with us today. We hope this exploration has been insightful.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.